Hello everyone, welcome to the Yogascapes in Japan podcast series. My name is Amy McCartney. Yogascapes in Japan is a 2-year project funded by the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science and is hosted by the Graduate School of Global Environmental Studies at Kyoto University, Japan. The aim of this project is to understand and document the popularity and consumption of global yoga within the Japanese cultural setting. Today's episode is part 1 of 4 from the Penn State Symposium on Yoga, Ethics and Neoliberalism. In April 2019, thanks to the Rock Ethics Institute, Dr. Jeremy Ingalls organised and moderated a stimulating day of public discussions amongst 4 of the world's leading scholars of modern yoga. Today's episode features Drs. Anya Foxen from California Polytechnic State University, Jitendra Jain from Indiana University, Purdue University, Krista Coolberry from Yoga Alliance, and Patrick McCartney from Kyoto University. Panel 1 discussion is about old beginnings on the past, present, and future of yoga.
Welcome everyone on this incredibly rainy but very State College morning.
Yes.
Right? Those of you who live here know. It's so nice to see you all, and I'm really excited to continue the conversation that we started yesterday at Andrea's talk. And so I'm Jeremy Ingalls. I'm an associate professor of communication arts and sciences. I'm also an affiliate faculty member with the Rock Ethics Institute, and my specialty is in American democratic theory and especially public rhetoric and discourse. And so I'm really interested in how we talk to each other, how we talk about things, also how we talk about controversial issues. And I've become increasingly interested in my research in yoga, just both for my research but also for my personal life as a yoga teacher and yoga studio owner. And in rhetoric, when I teach classes, one of the things we're really interested in is if there's a public controversy about a topic, sometimes it can be hard to know exactly what we're talking about. And so often we talk past each other, right? And so I thought one of the things that would be nice to do, if possible, would be to bring some brilliant scholars together, bring the community together, and have a conversation about yoga, but in particular have a conversation about how we should have a conversation about yoga. This is what we do as academics, right? We take it up to a second level. And in my field, one of the things that we do when we study a public controversy is we look for what we call stasis points. And these are the points of controversy or contention in a debate. So what really are the issues that we should be talking about? And so I'm hoping that over the course of our 3 panels today, that's one of the things that we can do is actually bring some clarity to this big controversy called yoga. I guess, can we call it a controversy?
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. We'll see. And so I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves here in a few minutes. And then I've got a few questions that I'm going to pose. I see my role mainly, I'm happy to offer my own thoughts and opinions on these questions because I've been thinking about them a lot myself, but I really see my role as holding space so that others can voice their opinions and thoughts. We talked a lot about privilege yesterday, and I think that that's one way that privilege can be put to good use is actually to create an opportunity for others to talk. And so that's really going to be my role today, is to hold space for all of you. And I'm really excited to hear what you all have to say, and for all of you. I thought we'd just take a moment, if it's okay. I try to do this before all of the classes I teach, especially my graduate classes, to just take a moment to breathe and focus and center. And so, is that okay for everyone? Yeah, cool. I figured it probably is. We're talking about yoga today. And so, if you wouldn't mind, just find a nice, comfortable seated position. Put your feet on the earth. so that you can really feel that support of the earth underneath your feet. And let your eyes close. And just take a moment to notice how you feel right now. Notice how your body feels. Notice how your mind is. Notice the breath. Notice your thoughts. Notice your feelings. So often in academia we treat ourselves and our students like we're brains on a stick, but we're not. We have bodies. And bring your focus to your breath and take 3 nice, easy breaths at whatever pace feels natural for you. And see if on your exhale you can relax just a little bit down into that support of the earth. And in one of the traditions of meditation that I'm particularly fond of, it's customary to listen to the sound of 3 bells as an opportunity to reset, as an opportunity to focus, as an opportunity to set an attention. And so, sitting nice and comfortably, breathing naturally, hearing the sound of the rain, we'll listen to the sound of 3 bells. Open your eyes. Good morning, friends. Hi. Thank you. Cool. Well, I thought we'd start by waking up. Would you all mind taking a moment just to introduce yourselves and say who you are? All at once. Yeah. We can go down the line. Andrew, do you want to start?
Sure.
Cool.
Sure, I'm Jitendra Jain. I am an associate professor of religious studies at Indiana University in Indianapolis, is the urban campus for IU. And I am a scholar of yoga, but also religion and contemporary culture. So my interest is really in understanding religion in the contemporary world through the lens of the yoga industry.
Hi, I'm Anya Foxon. I'm an assistant professor of religious studies and women's and gender studies at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, which is in California. I guess actually out of all of us here, I'm probably a little bit more on the historical side. I'll talk to real people and work on real people that are actually alive, I think. My work is primarily kind of focused around the turn of the century, so late 19th, early 20th, and trying to figure out how we got to where we are today in terms of modern yoga and the ways in which it came to be, essentially. And so kind of around those topics, I also focus on gender, the role of science and scientific discourse in terms of how it's sort of changed the way that we understand topics like yoga and spiritual practice in general. transitioning from a more pre-modern context where it maybe looks a little bit more like magic or something, to the sort of more medical, scientific ways in which we talk about it today. Yeah, so that's me.
Hi, I'm Krista Kuberi. I am currently the Vice President of Standards at Yoga Alliance, which is the credentialing body for yoga teachers and yoga schools for the world. And before that, I was a professor at the University of Denver as well as the University of Colorado, working in things like wellness, ethics, comparative religions. My dissertation research was on the identity of American yoga. So looking at not only how yoga has moved through history, but what it looks like, especially in the contemporary spaces and places where it is occurring. And then in the US, how it has become this combination of spiritual practice, business, self-help, self-care, just all of those conversations. And yeah, as the Vice President of Standards, my role is to look at 20-year-old standards for yoga teacher training programs and utilizing experts and research and my own kind of expertise, figure out what's the best way to responsibly move forward with the standards, creating up-leveled standards for both teachers, students, and then as well as like the community, so that they know what they're getting into when they walk into studios as well. So that's kind of my stuff. I'm also a yoga teacher and a yoga practitioner of like 20 years. So I taught teachers before I took this job. So I feel very passionate about all the different sides of yoga.
My name is Patrick McCartney. I'm based at Kyoto University in Japan. And yeah, so my arc is that I was an archaeologist and then a historical linguist. And then I became interested in sociolinguistics and the pedagogy of traditional learning methods of yoga in India. So I ended up in anthropology. I became more interested in the context as opposed to the texts, the Sanskrit texts that I was studying. And then I became really interested in the politics of yoga and the consumption of it. So now I basically look at the biographies of yoga and Sanskrit, the symbolic capital that these two products have, and how the Indian state uses them to brand India. So I look a lot at marketing, which 5 years ago, if you'd asked me, if you said, "Oh, Patrick, you're going to get right into marketing," I would have laughed at you. But that's where I live now, in this like interesting world of marketing and the role of affect and sentiment in terms of creating demand for things. So I look at yoga-inflected lifestyles and why people are interested in consuming them. And I'm unapologetic about talking about yoga consumers as opposed to practitioners or spiritual seekers. Or we all consume things, so I don't see why yoga gets to be kind of a sacred cow. So.
Well, welcome everyone. This is fantastic to bring all of you here to State College, and I wonder if I'm always really interested in people's, I don't know exactly what to call it, but people's yoga journey, maybe like how you came to be interested in yoga, practicing it or teaching it or studying it. Would you all care to share your journey or your story? Anybody want?
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't practice yoga.
Okay.
So I don't have a journey inside of yoga.
Uh-huh.
I'm not an insider. But in terms of how I came to find yoga as a academic area of research, I was in graduate school and I was getting my PhD and wanted to write a dissertation on Hindu bhakti, which is the Hindu devotionalism, and I was really interested in the psychosexual dimensions of Hindu bhakti and devotion to Krishna. So that was my plan. But I was also interested in religious change. So I was looking at a lot of social theory about how religion changes over time in response to different social contexts. And I was interested in like how that relates to the body, so how body practices change. My last name is Jain. which is a South Asian name and is associated with a particular religious complex in South Asia, even though I'm not an insider to that religious complex either. I'm kind of just a perpetual outsider. And yet, because of my name, I was approached by a group of Jains who wanted to sponsor graduate students to go to India and study Jainism. And I thought, well, sure, I'll be happy to spend summer in India, and I will be happy to study Jainism, because as a South Asianist, I need to know about Jainism, be able to teach about Jainism. So I went to India to study Jainism, and I encountered many Jains in many different parts of India, and we went out into the desert of Rajasthan to a particular ashram and met with a guru there who had invented a new form of yoga. And what fascinated me, and so we were talking to him about yoga, and what fascinated me about this yoga was that it echoed so much of what I heard stateside about what yoga is, what its purpose is. Many of the practices were similar to mainstream yoga studios here in the States. And so it made me question processes of globalization and exchange. And we think of India as responding reactively, I mentioned yesterday, to ideas coming from the West, yet it's much more complicated, the ebb and flow of ideas and practices. So I was just totally sucked into the modern yoga world. I thought, I have to understand how yoga came to be a part of global pop culture, and what it says about what we think about the body and what we do with our bodies, and how it's affected the way yoga is conceived and the body is conceived and dealt with from India to the U.S. So,
Gosh, let's see if I can pull this together now. So I am an insider, I guess, of a sort. I started out as a literature person. Actually, I was all ready to go get my PhD in Victorian literature, which is ironic in retrospect, because that's still basically the period that I'm studying, and I'm still talking about women essentially these days. It's just that now they're doing yoga rather than being Jane Eyre. Yeah, and then I started practicing yoga about maybe 15 years ago now. And this was back in New Jersey. I was at Rutgers University for my undergrad, and at a certain point, since we're talking about economics and things today, it became no longer feasible for me to practice without essentially having some kind of connection to the studio. So as one does, I went and at age 20 or whatever I was back then. Did a yoga teacher training and started teaching people that were often 2 to 3 times my age. And it was sort of a fascinating world to get dumped into, and it wasn't really academic for me at that point. I'd maybe taken some Hindu philosophy classes and things like that, but it began to occur to me that as I kind of delved deeper into Hinduism and Indian religion and philosophy, and I kept seeing the word yoga pop up everywhere, this yoga that I was finding in my academic work had nothing to do, ostensibly, with what I was practicing and what I was teaching in that studio. And so I think the summer before my senior year of undergrad, I essentially dropped everything and decided to do a PhD in something yoga related instead. And so I think here I am over 10 years later now, kind of still trying to figure out what is the relationship between now all this other stuff that I've read coming out of South Asia, and what it is that I still go and do several times a week, in a sweaty yoga studio. And so, I'm sure I'll talk a little bit more about kind of what that's looked like for me. I just finished up a book manuscript, so it's definitely where my head is at. But even though I think that, obviously here I am a scholar of yoga, right? Even though it's very much kind of an academic project for me at this point, it's still very personal, right? Like, I think my entry into yoga was always about trying to figure out, like, what is this thing? And what does it mean? And I think I've grown kind of more comfortable with the idea that what it means to me is not what it means to probably literally anybody else, right? And yoga, from a scholarly standpoint, right, is this hugely complicated, kind of historically diverse thing. But yoga, in terms of modern yoga in today's world, is like that too, right? Like, it's never been one thing. And so what I'm really trying to wrap my head around is, like, what are the many things that it is, and how does my conception of that fit into the larger picture?
So my journey with yoga, also poor grad student, played a role in it, which it seems like that's a theme. So I, in undergrad, got a religious studies minor and was really fascinated with Hinduism, and especially with looking at philosophy from, I was reading the Yoga Sutras, and I was reading the Bhagavad Gita, and I was all about it, and I got a lotus flower tattoo. I was ready. I was 18 at the University of Colorado. And then at the same time, I've always been an athlete. So I played sports competitively. I was a competitive snowboarder and soccer player. And so I would look at this yoga philosophy, but I wasn't thinking about it at all from a practical sense. And then very stereotypically, I went on vacation to Costa Rica with my boyfriend, and somebody was offering a yoga class on a beach, and it was the beautiful goddess teaching this yoga as, like, the waves were rolling, and but what she was talking about and what I was feeling in my body was something that I hadn't experienced from a sports perspective that was giving me a deeper connection. And so after taking that class and having this, yoga project, having this, like, super ordinary experience, I came back to the US and started practicing yoga. When I started my PhD, actually my master's was, I was looking at Islamic fundamentalism in the West. So very interested in identity politics and stuff like that. And then the Islamicist left the university that I was at. And so he got a chair job in Toronto. And so I was like, okay, I have all this identity stuff. I always really liked Hinduism, but then there wasn't a Hindu scholar. So when the Islamicists left, the Hindu scholar came in, and I started working with them. And then as a poor grad student, I was also working at a gym. So I was trading, like, cleaning the gym in 1 hour a week or whatever for a free membership. And they would have yoga classes at this gym, and it would be like hip hop playing, and it was, like, very intense, and people dropping the weights and doing the whole thing. But then people would come out of this class and be totally blissed, like yoga stoned. And so I was like, why isn't anybody talking about what this is? Like, this weird thing that's happening that's like yoga plus, sculpt plus all of these things. So, like, this phenomenon. And so I ran into my advisor's office, and I was like, I found it. I know what I want to do. I want to write about the identity of American yoga. And he was like, somebody's done that. And I was like, I don't think so, And so anyway, I ended up going through this whole process of having to talk to many librarians about the fact that nobody had written this project yet. And so then I spent I'm still in some ways spending the rest of my adult life looking at this stuff and being really interested in how this works in the contemporary space, and how myself, as a yoga practitioner and somebody that very much probably plays into the conscious capitalism and all of that, and how I can and both understand myself, understand the bigger picture of yoga. I'm not the type, similar to I would say Anya, like, I'm not the type to be like, oh, I'm doing something, it's interesting, and stay surface level. I'm very much like, I like this, and then it's all the way down. So, I really have dedicated my entire adult life to yoga, from both a personal practice as well as a scholarly perspective, and now in my role as helping with standards. So it's interesting to think about. I think it's like Steve Jobs that says you can't ever see, like, what happens until you look back at how all the points connect. So if I would have known that, like, working at a yoga or at a gym and having this epiphany would have been, a change of my entire career. But yeah, here we are.
I think we can blame Rudyard Kipling for me being here. Yeah, that's, you know, reading the Jungle Book, you know, that's what got me interested in, through some nice Orientalist gaze of India, I suppose. But when I was about 10, I couldn't walk properly, and I had really bad knees and hips. I still kind of do. And the doctor sent me to the physio, and the physio prescribed me 2 hours of stretching to do each day. And if I didn't do it, so I did an hour before school and an hour before I went to bed, and if I didn't do it, I ended up in crutches or in a wheelchair. And so, having to do that for a few years, I got yoga stoned kind of thing. I mean, I didn't know what yoga was, right? But I stretched, and I got interested in stretching and all these kind of different, you know, I started doing some martial arts, and then I was reading my sister's 1 year younger than me, and so she had, you know, some girly magazine. I was, you know, trying to get some tips, and I read an article about yoga, and I thought, that sounds pretty similar to what I'm doing, you know. So I was about probably 14 at the time, and I started, you know, I didn't have the internet back then. Went through the newspaper, and I, you know, saw an ad for a yoga class, so I started going to that. By about the age of 19, I was teaching 4 classes a week, and learned a few different styles of yoga, and learned some Tai Chi, and, you know, taught around the world for 20 years or something, in a kind of piecemeal way. I didn't really, it was more like, well, I'm backpacking, and maybe I need some money, so let's set up a yoga class. And, you know, at some point I was living in Kolkata for several months and teaching like 6 or 7 classes a day to whoever turned up. That's what happens when you lose your credit card, and then the bank sends it to a different country. But yeah, just things that happen to you. So I ended up spending 7 years in India, and mostly in the north. And I think what I've been working on the last couple of years is just trying to untangle and walk myself back from all the things the curious things that have happened to me in India in that time. And so I don't consider myself a practitioner anymore. I don't really do yoga so much. I mean, I do some push-ups and some dips and some twerks, yeah. And I found it quite difficult to kind of straddle that scholar-practitioner kind of boundary. So it'd be interesting to, you know, hear more about that today, how that works. I tried pretty hard to balance that in some way, but I think it's more the criticism from others, or the perception that others have. It seems in yoga land there's a very kind of non-academic preference. You know, it's anti-intellectual. So I've noticed trying to talk to people that as soon as they realize that you're an academic of yoga, they really just want to tune out because they don't really value what you might have to say. So yeah, it's a curious thing anyway. And what I've been trying to do, well, the project I'm moving towards now is looking at sustainability. So, you know, we're all talking about consumption and commodification, and I've started thinking about, and a lot of scholars who focus on yoga seem to focus on North America, and that's what I've been doing in Japan the last couple of years, is looking at yoga in Japan and kind of East Asia more generally, because no one's written about it, and that's the thing. And no one's really written about yoga in the global south or developing countries, especially looking at tourism and, you know, the supply chain of the carbon supply chain of, so 10% of the world's carbon emissions is a direct result of tourism, right? But the United Nations wants more people to help develop the global south through tourism. And you've got wellness tourism, yoga tourism, spiritual tourism, all this. So that's kind of where I've been heading at. And that's where all the marketing and rhetoric and stuff comes in. Yeah. So.
I don't know, do you all want to talk about scholar, practitioner, what that's like? I mean, I think it's an interesting space in which to exist. And I think it's also an interesting what you were saying, Patrick, about yoga, maybe practitioners and their relationship to academics. I think we've started a yoga studio in town, and I think our yoga studio might just be idiosyncratic in that way, given that pretty much all of our teachers and practitioners are incredibly intelligent academic types, and I don't know. So I think our relationship's pretty natural, I would say. But I find that really interesting, actually. I know my own experience is just a little different, but my experience is pretty narrow. But I don't know, do you all want to talk about that? I mean, I don't have to ask all of the questions today, too. Actually. I do have a question I want to ask about defining yoga, and I want to have an opportunity for folks to ask some questions of the panel before we break off for our first. But I think that scholar-practitioner question is a really interesting. I find it interesting. I don't know if you all do, and if yeah. Do you have any thoughts or
Thoughts?
Yeah?
Yeah. I think, it can go both ways. I think there is something that can be really valuable about being an insider into something that you're studying. It can also color your lens in ways that are problematic. I think especially in the yoga space, if I wasn't a practitioner, I don't know that I would be taken as seriously by the general public. Whereas, in the academic sphere, if I'm not a scholar, I wouldn't have been taken as seriously. So it is there is a trend towards anti-intellectualism in the popular culture of yoga. And I think being a practitioner of it and being, I have the Lululemon pants and all the things, I think that does give me some credibility in the popular culture spaces. I think it goes back to kind of some of the things that Andrea was saying about yesterday. But it's all about being self-reflexive too, right? Do I know where I sit as an academic and as a practitioner, and can I talk about that and be vulnerable and be self-aware to it, versus if, from a non-practitioner perspective, like an etic perspective and an emic perspective, and looking at those from what we think about as academic modeling, I don't know that I don't believe in objectivity. So I think that there is no real line, black and white, between those two things. But I think that the space where I sit personally, it really helps for me to be both. It helps my research, it helps me be able to talk to people, it helps me to understand the hustle of the average yoga teacher and what it feels like to be teaching 15 classes a week and making $20 a class, and how that plays into the business side of yoga. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I would just building on that. I think it's really important to think about the ways we're related to our subjects, whether we're insiders or outsiders or both. It really frames the kinds of questions we ask. And so I think you're more likely to ask certain questions if you're an insider, and you're more likely to ask different questions if you're an outsider. And for me, being an outsider is more suitable because I'm a comparativist. So I like to think about patterns across cultural spaces. And so standing on the outside, for me, feels like a way to more clearly see patterns across subcultures in the contemporary world. But then I might be blind to certain questions that the insiders might be more inclined to ask. And so it's never a full view. Either way, you're sacrificing something. Kind of depends on the types of questions you're prioritizing.
Yeah, I think for me, when I first got into this, Krista, I envisioned doing something that's maybe closer to what you're doing, right? And really staying kind of not only engaged in both the academic, scholarly, and the practitioner side of things, but also kind of bringing those two together more. And I think where I found myself, right, and I'm still kind of trying to figure out where I'm going to go from here, is that I am, right, I am both a scholar and a practitioner, but I don't know that those two worlds really converge for me anywhere that's outside of just my personal experience and what I do, right, when I go into a yoga class. Because I have a yoga teaching certification, but I haven't taught a yoga class in probably close to, almost 10 years now, 7, 8, something like that. I still practice, but I'm not sure that actually, like, what I imagine myself to be practicing, I would even call yoga, because of just how much I've read over the last 10 years. And so I'm even though I think I would declare myself to be like a scholar practitioner, I don't know what that means exactly from like a practical standpoint, right? I think that my scholarship is very much guided by this sort of personal investment, right? Like I really like origin narratives, right? Like I like to figure out where does this thing come from. And of course, right, the reason that I care about where yoga comes from is because I was, fascinated with it for the entirety of my adult life. But yeah, I feel like they're kind of these two separate worlds for me, and it's neat every once in a while to reflect kind of how they bounce off of each other. But yeah, it just strikes me as kind of very different from like what I see you doing.
Right. I want to be the bridge.
But and then you go out there and you actually talk to yoga practitioners about your scholarship, whereas I just like avoid that, right? Like constantly and emphatically. Like I walk into the studio, I put my head down, and I'm like, okay, like I'm gonna get in, I'm gonna do my poses, and I'm gonna get out, right?
Red pill.
In my PhD, I spent 15 months in this yoga ashram on the west coast of India, about 3 hours north of Mumbai. And all I did was try and think and write about as much as I could about what happened within the 20 acres of this ashram. And I became really interested in knowledge and how knowledge is produced and what knowledge is valued. And that was really kind of the tipping point when I was, the scholar practitioner. I mean, it's a kind of seductive term, right? And it kind of rolls off the tongue really easily, and you can kind of use it flippantly, I think, in some ways to try and build rapport with people. But then you find that some people actually think that it's a bit of a cop-out, that term. Oh, he thinks he's a scholar practitioner or something. So it really made me question when people were criticizing me for using this term as a way to kind of build rapport. I found that, I do yoga, but I also write about yoga. So that was interesting. But one anecdote from my fieldwork was basically in this community, they spend probably 7 hours a day chanting a variety of mostly Sanskrit texts, but also Marathi and Hindi devotional texts. And I'm there with my notebook and my video camera and my microphone, just trying to talk to people about everything. Why do you come here? What does this do for you in your life? What's your relationship to the people here? And all this. And I remember one guy said to me, he's like, Patrick, why don't you just come to the temple and chant like the rest of us? I mean, I did go and do all the chanting and everything. It's like, why don't you just forget this PhD nonsense? This is just minds, this is ego stuff, So then I started to think, how can I reframe, use the insider terms to help justify my position here? And I said, so I started calling myself a jnani. Jnana yoga was my thing. I'm not a bhakti. Right? I'm very kind of analytical. So singing devotional songs just isn't my thing. But have at it if it's your thing. So So then that was a funny thing. So as soon as I said, "Well, I'm a jnani," they were like, "Oh, okay." So it kind of worked in that way, trying to find some term that they could relate to. So scholar practitioners, some people use it, some people don't.
I think we're always doing this as scholars. We're just playing with words, right? And translating. We're always engaged in some form of translation. Yet it's never really. There's never a direct translation, right? So, of course, you really weren't doing jnana yoga,
No.
right? Yet it was the closest thing that
Yeah.
you could get at to communicate what you were trying to do, or at least got them off your backs. Your
Yeah,
back.
yeah, yeah.
And that's just interesting to me because I think ultimately I feel like I do speak a different language than my subjects, and so I feel like honestly I don't share the same values. It's not the same purpose. It's not the same language. We're not living in the same world, and so for me there is this like radical disconnect between my subjects and myself. So it's fascinating to me to hear about people who straddle these boundaries and speak two languages. I think it really does create totally different frameworks for scholarship that are it's valuable. I mean, I think you need both. But it's fascinating.
Do you all think, I was just thinking about that translation that you're speaking about, which makes perfect sense to me, and you could have these two different worlds that maybe come together at some points or they're disconnected. Do you all think that we as scholars of yoga have any responsibility to shape the language by which people practice yoga? I'm just curious.
Well, I think scholars have a responsibility to shape culture generally.
Yeah.
So it's not just about yoga.
Sure.
I think it's just about being a humanities scholar. And being a scholar in general, that we have a responsibility to, it sounds cliche, but make the world a better place. And so reflect on the extent to which human culture is contingent on so many different variables, and then educate about this contingency, and get people to reflect critically on their own situatedness in the world, and how that compares to other people's situatedness and other species situatedness. And so, yeah, I think, if you're going to do yoga scholarship well, you should be impacting the way people think about yogic spaces and yogic identities, and the impact of the yoga industry. Yeah.
Well, and so I think there's, how do I formulate this? Right, there's something weird about religious studies, in a sense, as a field, where we have this kind of like constant need to question our relationship to our subject in a way that maybe other disciplines don't as much. Right, to be an insider in the context of religious studies, right, means there's this whole bunch of baggage that comes with that, right, and it's bound up in theology and right, all this kind of stuff. You would never ask, a biologist or something like, well, are you looking to make interventions in how people understand biology? Like, of course you are, right? Like, what else are you doing? But if you ask like a religious studies person, like, are you looking to affect the way that people think about their religion? Then that becomes kind of a whole other set of issues. But I think you're right, Andrea, right? Like, maybe we're not trying to do theology and reformulate how people view their religious beliefs, but like it's all culture, right? And I think as scholars, if we're doing our jobs well, like we of course should be kind of shaping how it is that culture is formulated and articulated and sort of comes together.
Right. So producing historical knowledge, you're helping people understand where they fit into a story, right? And what that story has done in terms of producing certain identities, or what how the historical story differs from whatever story they've been carrying around, and what that means. And then in all of our work, we're interested in power, right? And so as we consider the way power is played out in yogic spaces, then and write about that, then we hope that people, in reading what we write or taking our courses, they will reflect on power and power dynamics and think about the power they have or don't have and why that matters.
I feel strongly kind of in like the J.Z. Smith model of like it's our responsibility to shape in some ways, but also to complicate, and so to continue to open up spaces for more voices, and to try to show that none of this is monolithic or linear, and therefore be a voice for continuing conversations that allow for us to recognize that, there is no meta-narrative, that there's multiple narratives, and especially in the yoga space, because issues of authenticity and tradition are such hot-button topics that we both recognize that there are traditions and historical contexts and people doing things that are important, but there's more than one person's experience and one person's perspective that came to shape what yoga looks like today. And so, at least from my perspective as scholars, it's also the opportunity to complicate the discourse by bringing up the multiple genealogies and the various understandings of the world that needs to be talked about, as well as how those play into colonialism, power, consumption, and have those conversations so that, nothing is simple. I like complex. And I think that's what... I think that's part of what our role is too, is to make clear while we complexify.
Simplify complexities.
Simplify complexities. And complexify simplicities.
We're always simplifying just by using language.
Yeah, we have to,
And so that, but again, as outsiders, we're using a different language than the insiders, and so in that way it's complex.
I think if you look at the commodification of anything across a global market, we simplify science, right, to make it more appealing to different cultures and whatever. And of course, each market adds their own kind of unique thing to it. But then that can lead us to this whole problem with the monolithic narratives of yoga. And so I think, at least the way I look at what I'm trying to do is to add nuance to present an alternative that yoga isn't just 60,000 years old. So nuance. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think you all answered the next question that I want to ask already, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Because I wrote it out. And so
Plan.
That is the plan. I'm going to stick to my agenda. No. But I know that when I talk about yoga, one of the questions I often get is, what is yoga? We know, I was looking at one of my Sanskrit dictionaries this morning, and the entry for yoga is pages long, right? It has over 80 definitions in Sanskrit. A few of them I was looking up this morning: yoking, joining, meditation, magic, divine illusion, astrological calculation, the equipping of an army for battle. In the Mahabharata, yogis can be pandits, secret agents, liars, great warriors, sorcerers, mercenaries, circus performers, philosophers, and business people. That's a pretty capacious word, right? And then, of course, as the yogic texts were translated into the languages of Europe, these definitions spin out of control. Schlegel translated the Bhagavad Gita into Latin for some reason in 1817, and he would not choose one word for yoga, and so he translated yoga with about 60 or 70 synonyms in Renaissance church Latin. And so then that becomes really interesting too. And so I think for me, the question of what is yoga it's a definitional question, but it's also a hermeneutics question, right? Of how do we go about defining yoga? Or do we? I think all of the themes of nuance and complexity and alternative histories and alternative voices, I think provides an answer potentially to this question, but I'm really curious how all of you, I'm sure you get this question. How do you all tackle it or engage it?
You've written on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think, I have written about it a little bit, but I'd say I maybe if I, scholars are famous for writing things and then 2 months later thinking, that's not true. That was so way off.
Wait, you do that as well?
Yeah. So I've made the argument that yoga is polythetic, meaning it has many meanings in it. Yoga is what yoga practitioners say it is, right? And this is just echoing what has already been said, because David Gordon White famously said about language in particular that yoga has probably more meanings than any other word in the Sanskrit lexicon, right? And I just think that's continued to be true even in the contemporary world. Yoga just means what it's. I think what unites yoga is the term yoga, right? That it's language. I think also yoga is for many yoga practitioners, whether they be South Asian practitioners, more traditional types of yoga, or people practicing yoga in very pop culture contexts. One of the things that unites yoga practitioners is a narrative about South Asian origins. It's the story. And so there are sort of these prototypical qualities that I think especially come up with regard to narrative more so. Myth making more so than practice. But also, I think that maybe we should just not ask this question at all. So, I asked the question and I addressed it in previous work, but now I'm less inclined to ask the question. And I think now what I might be more inclined to do is say, it doesn't matter what yoga is. What matters is how yoga is deployed. And so maybe we should start asking, how is yoga as this category deployed? And what we'll find is that it's deployed in many different ways, right? But that tells us a lot about the context in which it's practiced and why it's practiced and what the values are and what the purpose is and what power dynamics are and such. So I'm more inclined toward that question. Yeah.
I just quoted your full, the definition that you lay out in Selling Yoga. It's this little paragraph somewhere in the introduction to my manuscript. Well, and what I found really useful about kind of what you said there and what you were doing, right, is this idea of yoga is about what people say it is, right, and how they deploy it and what they do with it. And the reason that was interesting and useful for me is that it's sort of. I think you did this a little bit with the sort of yoga phobic,
right? I started there.
That kind of stuff. It's not that if we want to talk about yoga in some kind of holistic way, it's not just even about looking at things that people say is yoga. It's also about looking at things that people continue to insist are not yoga. Right, but then they're still using that word, so they're kind of defining what they're doing against this other thing.
Right, like Pilates. That's a good example. Yeah.
Well, and so right, I think there's this element of as scholars, right, we might assign this label of yoga to things that the practitioners won't use that word for, right? Because from this sort of the meta perspective, it's that you're still interacting with that world, this category. And so the way that was useful for me then, right, because this is maybe kind of informed by me being a practitioner, I'm definitely interested in terms of, or looking at how yoga is sort of deployed, right, in power structures and all this kind of stuff. But I also, because I do the thing, right, it's been kind of important for me to figure out, what is it that I'm functionally doing, right? If there's a practice there, right, what is the practice? And what does that look like, and what does it actually sort of accomplish? And so what that got me into kind of thinking about is, yes, we can look at things that are called yoga or not called yoga, right? But it can also, you can kind of flip that and think about the ways in which, right, the things that do get called yoga are actually kind of internally very different. And even just in the modern world, right, let's forget about the long history and dictionary definitions of that term. But if you just, kind of lay out a sample of the practices that word is applied to today. And then you look at, okay, what is the practice actually, right? When a person does it, not only what is their body doing, and are they moving, are they breathing, what's going on a physical level, but what do they think they're doing, right? What is this practice accomplishing for them on a metaphysical level? And then you bump into this interesting thing where actually the way that people imagine their practice is really, really different. And it has all these different sort of internal logics, right? So how do you define just a full lived experience, of that. And then, right, and then here, like, we're dealing with only a very, very small subset of what yoga has historically meant and can currently mean. I defined it, I think, as what did I say? The spiritualized breath movement practice. That's my definition that I came up with in the intro. But, right, like, it's always contingent, and it's always just talking about, like, the thing that we've decided we're talking about.
Right. And that thing moves.
Yeah, and that thing moves. And it should, right? Like,
But literally, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important. I very much appreciated Andrea's definition in her book and continue to use this polythetic notion. I think also that's another place where if we're going to define what is yoga, it's another place where we should be asking the practitioners about what it is that they are defining it as, because clearly if it's been a trick and an astrological symbol and all these things, it means different things, and it means something different to... This is hard. So there's like the category of yoga, right, that we can all agree that people say is yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind, right? Like that's the answer that you get when you ask. But that's, again, located in Patanjali's notion of yoga. But I think it's more interesting if we ask what yoga is with the context of understanding, and I'll always go back to history, understanding, yes, there is a South Asia thing, there are texts, there are practices that have been now defined within that space as yogic. I also think that it's really important that we continue to land that in the experiences of contemporary bodies doing something that they themselves are calling yoga. And I don't know if that's not particularly satisfying, I guess, probably as an answer, but I think the most important piece of it is the polythetic piece of the idea of continuing that has never been one thing and will not continue to be one thing going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mike, you're on.
I do a lot of work talking to people who do yoga, and it's always curious to me how quickly they are, or how rigid they seem to be, at least, in defining yoga, and more in the negative. That's not yoga. So obviously the next question is, well, what is yoga to you, right? So I'm asking that question all the time, because I want to know. I want to know what they think yoga is, and in a descriptive way. I don't really care what people think yoga is or not. But then it gets really kind of dogmatic and quite inflexible, at least some people, not everyone. And yeah, everyone seems to like go, yeah, yoga's chitta-vritti nirodha.
Yeah, that's exactly
what
that's
yoga
the
is.
answer
It's
you
like,
get.
come on. I mean, throughout history, there were plenty of people who didn't really think Patanjali's system was all that great.
Right.
The Pashupattas from the 7th to the 11th century had a completely different idea of yoga. Yoga to them was the minimalist effort possible to realize the distinction or the relationship between the subject and the object. It had nothing to do with tapasya of holding your arm up or getting your leg behind your head. It was about realizing that tension and finding that, trying to focus in on like the gap between thoughts. That was yoga to these people, 1,000 years ago. And so to me, I kind of take that definition. So that's the definition I kind of work with. Yoga to me is an epistemology. It's a filter for reality. Because I can't stick my feet behind my head, so I had to go for another route, I suppose. And I find it really curious how, if you look at like just about any yoga-related website, like Yogapedia, and it has a history of yoga, and it says, yoga's found in the Rig Veda, but then they give you this definition that's at least 5 centuries later.
Yeah.
They give you the Upanishadic the definition from the Brihadaranyaka and the kind of the Katha Upanishad as well. The Para Atman and the Jiva Atman. You've got the microcosm and the macrocosm, and it's the union of them. But then they defer to the Rig Veda, and the definition in the Rig Veda is it's martial, it's related to warfare, it's related to putting on the armor, yoking the cattle to the cart, going out. It's in the context of yoga and kshema, of action. In the early Rig Veda, yoga means action. It doesn't mean union, actually. It means action. And that's going out within a martial context of engaging in battle and dying, hoping to die a valiant warrior's death facing the enemy on the battlefield, so you could literally get picked up by a flying chariot and literally fly through the sun to some like Valhalla-like afterlife of drinking soma with all your warrior buddies. It was essentially like the epitome of toxic masculinity in some way, right? And you don't see that definition come out in just about any kind of thing to do with yoga. It's like a completely different one. And of course, meanings of things change over time, and that's fine. But I just find it really curious how there are so many places in which you'll find, oh yeah, yoga is found in the Rig Veda, but then they use this definition that's like half a millennia down the road, and I don't know why that is, and I'm really curious
about that. I mean, what you're describing, it's a very typical insider logic. I mean, I don't think that I want to call it like Vedantic necessarily, but if you kind of look at how, right, like what are the Upanishads doing in relation to, like, right, as Veda, right, as still that category, right? They're expounding on the hidden meaning of the sacrifice, right? And then if you look at the Vedanta tradition and how it develops historically, right, like there is this little like chain that gets built, where like ultimately, right, of course it comes back to the Rig Veda, but depending on who's reading, or not even reading, but sort of imagining this category of the Veda, right? I mean, like Madhva thinks it's all about Krishna, right? Like we read the Rig Veda, Krishna's not in there either,
right?
But yet it becomes, right, there's this way to like read this stuff into like what came before, because that's how the tradition is built.
I don't know if it's willful ignorance or if there's an agenda to, I mean, I don't know why they can't just add an extra sentence that says, well, yeah, yoga's mentioned in the Rig Veda, but the definition we're working with is like
very different.
But that would be
authority.
It's authority and authenticity, right?
And that's not a scholarly
That doesn't
definition.
sell.
That's a practitioner definition.
Yeah, I mean, branding is about authority, establishing authority and authenticity too. I mean, you can't sell a product if you can't make a case that it's the best product. And bestness is about rooting. It's another sort of myth making, right? Branding, and so you've got to make a claim for it being the best because it's authentic, or it's the best because it's the most ancient or constant.
It's shruti.
Yeah. Another question we haven't really asked in response to this question, which scholars love to do. They love to respond to questions with questions. In response to the question, what is yoga? I might respond quoting myself. Who's to say what is yoga? Who's to say what is yoga? And I find this question to be important because I think that it gets at the fact that questions about definitions are political, right? And so it's we need to always be asking how we are deploying not just yoga, but deploying our own power by defining yoga. And so yoga insiders love to do this. They love to define yoga as a way of exercising their power. And this is when you define yoga, you're excluding certain people, right? So you're creating outgroups. And so that's the kind of danger of defining yoga.
But in some ways, too, you're having these other people being empowered by finding power and defining yoga, like the whole Kemetic yoga movement, where there's a lot of African American populations that are finding relationships to yoga in ancient Egypt, and so have this whole narrative around that, and like finding that as a way for them to feel power in yogic spaces, both that they didn't feel like they had power in just because there are a lot of white privileged bodies, but also because they didn't relate to that history.
And not all pursuits of power are bad.
And that's right.
Sometimes it's very reasonable and ethical to pursue power, right? Because you've been oppressed and you've been the victim of power inequities. So I think in those cases, power is sought very differently and for different reasons than the ways power is sought in white dominant spaces. Or in Hindutva spaces, right? In India, where Narendra Modi is attempting to define yoga as a kind of sort of political strategy, very specifically,
And very Hindu.
Yeah, we're gonna have plenty of time for questions today. But are there any questions right now for this wonderful panel of experts? Yeah.
Well, I studied Ayurveda, and I have a few questions. I try to put them together. But when we look at yoga, we always in my personal opinion, is we look at it as something to define. It's like it is not to be defined when I look at it from an Ayurvedic point of view. It is a philosophy. It's way beyond being defined into a sentence or into 60 words or anything like this. Where we look at how popular yoga is, we look at the yoga asana mostly. That's what people do. So that's the movement of yoga. Maybe there should be movement yoga or something added to define a little bit that is one aspect of a whole big thing which is over there. And that thing is a study which can be on an academic point of view, which has nothing to do between the practitioner and looking at the philosophy of yoga, which is completely different, which is very ignored by, from looking at it from a philosophical point of view. It's a way of life, it's almost, it's not into Hinduism, it's into Buddhism, into Jainism. It's all over, yoga has been mentioned there. And my question is basically how to define how people define or look at the studies of yoga from an academic point of view, or is it from an intellectual point of view? It's they look completely different, right? When you study it from an academic point of view, you look at all the aspects, from historical point of view, in comparative, and to gender, and to society, and to capitalism, and look at it and put it on the table without being into it, being, this is what's happening, more on a research point of view. And when it's from an intellectual point of view, which is basically most of the Veda, which is that people start thinking and they discuss about it, and what do you think, and what do I think, and my opinion is like that. So is there a division between academically looking at Ayurveda, at yoga, and intellectually looking at yoga?
It sounds to me like what you're articulating is this kind of insider-outsider split, right? To be I think what you're calling intellectual approaches to yoga, these are sort of constructive approaches, right? And yeah, I think maybe philosophical is not a bad word for it, right? Trying to get to some kind of yeah. Whereas the academic side of it, I think, is a little bit more descriptive, right? And just, as you said, kind of laying it out there and trying to sort of just map the thing rather than navigate it from the inside, right? And actually use it as a means to an end, whether that end is enlightenment or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. To me, it sounds like the sort of that is the scholar practitioner thing.
Yeah, right. The intellectual piece being actually the philosophizing over what it is, right? And the academic piece being the construction of research and data points and being able to put, right? And those are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Yeah.
But I think they can be.
They can be, right? You can do,
they're
just try to do
distinct.
both. It's messy.
But do we always try to mix? Are people always trying to find that definition? And what does yoga mean to you? And what does yoga mean to you? It's when we ask this question, when people ask, how do you feel about yoga? What does yoga mean to you? It sounds to me more religious. It's what does Christianity mean to you? What does Islam mean to you? And then we start having our own definition of something which has, it's a way, it's there. So I just struggle in maybe the word yoga has to be divided into different, the why should be something and the how should be something, because there's so much in there, and everybody's trying to find like everything in that word of yoga and trying to either give give their opinion about it, or the positive side of it, or the negative side of it, and it's all under this thing which I get lost into. Do I practice yoga? I don't even know anymore.
I think that's how most people. I don't know.
Is this yoga? Is this not yoga? It's like, yeah.
Well, the Happy Valley Improv here at Penn State is talking about using arts as a way of thinking about things, and I compare yoga a lot to arts. Mm-hmm. It's transmission. It's beyond what an intellectual thing can do with it. That's what arts are, and to me that's what yoga is. And so I had a question, Jeremy, for you, because you're at Penn State and you're my colleague, and also for the panel about if academics see yoga as anti-intellectualism, what do academics see yoga as? If academics are only thinking that because they're into the body, mind, spirit thing, that they're anti-intellectual, then what do the intellectuals think about people that are using somatic intelligence?
I love it.
Yeah,
I don't really experience it as that binary, because I think yoga practitioners are so varied. Yeah, so I think, I wouldn't kind of blanket yoga practitioners under any one category, or some of them are more intellectual, academic than others.
But I'm hearing that binary with that point of view of that's anti-intellectual. That's binary.
Well, it is the experiential piece, right? Like, I think for a lot of academics, especially, like, yoga is a practice that is embodied, right? And so it's like we can't necessarily talk. The embodiment piece isn't an intellectual practice;
right.
It's an experiential practice, right? And so I think the more the question isn't as much anti-intellectualism versus intellectualism, but embodied experience versus the mind, right? And so, like, Descartes was wrong.
The anti gives it that anti.
Yeah,
it's a binary.
It's so binary. And so I think it's no mistake that the panel is sitting the way it is either, with the bridge in the middle.
Oh.
That's the way the universe works.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question though, because I know that I don't know what your all experiences are like necessarily, but there's a kind of legitimate, almost like a legitimation crisis for me as an academic when it comes to studying yoga. My colleagues don't understand what I'm doing.
Except for this one.
No, exactly. So that was a bad sentence. I have a number of colleagues who don't understand what I'm doing. And more than that, actually, I have a number of colleagues who raise questions about the legitimacy of studying something like yoga. And I think in part because it's embodied, actually. And so I see part of what's so interesting to me about practices of yoga, meditation, and mindfulness is the embodied nature of that practice, and how that, for us in the humanities, opens up a possibility of talking about how all knowledge is embodied. Because it is. And I think that the more that we can incorporate experiential practices into our classrooms and into our teaching, the better off our students will be. And so that line between the humanities and the arts, for me, is a line that just needs to be obliterated. And so I way overgeneralize in saying my colleagues don't understand.
Jeremy, if I may say, it's because I'm tenure exempt. That makes me different.
There's a whole politics.
There's a whole politics around that.
What can and cannot be taken seriously.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and I find it's interesting actually when I have to go often to some of the statistics that things like Yoga Alliance provide about how many people practice yoga, how much money is spent on the yoga industry, and in order to gain a kind of legitimacy to this study, and I think that's interesting, actually. And I do think so much of it is the embodied nature of, and the potentially transgressive nature of the things that we study.
And the self-sovereignty.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, there is a tremendous power in caring for the self. There can be, right? And I think that'll be one of the things we'll talk about in our next session. That was something you talked about yesterday too, and so yeah. But I'm curious what your experiences have been.
I just want to add that this whole resistance to taking the academic study of yoga seriously, I think, is also gendered. Because when we talk about yoga in pop culture, we think of suburbanite soccer moms clad in spandex and trying to look sexy, and nobody wants to take those people seriously. But why can't suburbanite soccer moms have spiritual communities and serious practices, and be addressing serious philosophical questions through practice? I think they absolutely can, but I think that many of our colleagues are resistant to acknowledging that and taking it seriously.
I think there's actually a lot of resistance within yoga land towards soccer moms.
Yeah.
And that kind of,
There's attention.
I mean, there's as much kind of building walls within yoga land.
Absolutely, yeah.
Than I think I'm trying to understand what those walls are and how high they go, and not necessarily worrying about the scholar practitioner thing. I mean, at least in my field work, and I do a lot of work talking to yoga teachers and people who do yoga in different ways, and they spend more time talking about what they're trying to delegitimize other people who are doing yoga, particularly like the yoga light. There's some people that you haven't been to India, then you're not a real yogi, that type of thing. But some people don't want to go to India. They're terrified of going to India. So is their yoga any less real to them because they haven't been to India? Or do you have to go to India to do yoga?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that this is partly what I was hoping that today would do, is just raise some of these questions, that I think they're so interesting and foundational, I'm thinking, I wrote about this in my gratitude book, but I had a conversation. It's very, very vivid in my mind because it happened out in that lobby with a good friend of mine. I'm not going to say who she is, but she's a very prominent professor on campus, and we were talking about yoga, and she said to me, "Jeremy, I just don't understand what you're doing." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And she said, "Yoga is nothing more than a distraction for wealthy people so that they can feel better about their lives, when in fact they should be out on the picket lines." And she said, "Actually, I think what you're doing is unethical." And so that's a very, very, very extreme position. And I don't know that that's a common position, but that was a very vivid conversation I had.
Well, I think it is in the study of religion and spirituality. It's a common position. And that's the kind of position I'm trying to critique.
Yeah.
Yet also, pull out what I think is valuable.
Right,
because I think yoga can be a way, it's a strategy through which we avoid actually addressing social problems. Yet, it's complicated.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a both and, right? Like, we know that just even practicing mindfulness makes you more compassionate and all of these things from the scientific perspective. At the same time, there is like the spiritual bypassing that can happen, with like buying good as being good and those types of ideas. So that it's like a bigger conversation. And even like, I remember going to the AAR, the American Academy of Religion conference, like maybe 5 years ago, and somebody asked me what I did, and I said I was a yoga scholar, and they were like, "That exists?" You're looking at it. So that's also a fairly new kind of idea of what that even means to be a scholar of yoga, and a scholar of modern yoga especially, and then to bring in the experiential piece and call that out as an important part, which, the whole Enlightenment movement was basically about, like, the mind is what's important, the body is secondary, and it's like that. I think part of what yoga in general and why it is so popular, why it's grown 50% every year for the past 5 years, is because it does bring in the embodied experience of humanity that we have been ignoring to a certain extent for such a long period of time. And so it's like we have to be, as scholars and people that are taken seriously in these spaces, continue to insert ourselves in those spaces and say that this does matter and the body is important and those types of things in order for us to maybe move away or move towards getting taken seriously.
Yeah, and I've found that it's just my own particular approach, I think, to this question is to relate the kinds of things, at least that I'm interested in my yoga practice and philosophy and teaching, to what I consider to be the best traditions of the humanities and the liberal arts, right? Understanding ourselves as embodied beings in a particular time and place, who view the world from a particular perspective, and that perspective is limited but can be expanded, as beings that exist within power structures, but as interconnected beings, right? I mean, that's the thing that originally got me interested in studying yoga really was Zen, actually. And so Andrew, we were talking last night, actually, when Anna and I got home a little bit about Zen and how that was popping up in your talk in such interesting ways. But when I was in high school, I found myself so frustrated with this atomized vision of the individual, right? That I know now is the kind of individual that's commodified by neoliberalism, and that it really is, taught to us in so many different traditions. And it was, for me, I mean, what I had access to was really Zen texts, actually, and there was a decentering of the individual that happens through a kind of Zen practice. Well, D.T. Suzuki, who's a really important he's a Japanese teacher of Zen, but he comes to the United States and teaches Zen, studied with John Dewey. And so I went to grad school wanting to write about John Dewey, actually, and democracy and some of these other traditions of thinking about democracy. And the book that got me interested in studying rhetoric was actually Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a book about a teacher of rhetoric. And I still think one of the best definitions of rhetoric that I've ever read is actually offered in that book. He talks about how we construct our reality through language, which I think is a pretty good definition of rhetoric, actually. It's an expansive definition of rhetoric. Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I don't know why I started talking about Zen and the Art of Motorcycle. I find my mind drifts back to that book, which is quite insufferable, actually, in some ways now when I read it. But we're going to take a little break, and we'll come back together about 10:45. You're all welcome to stay to continue the conversation. Webster's is catering a vegan lunch for us at about 12:15, and there will be plenty of food for everyone if folks would like to stay for that. And so we'll be back in a few. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. Stay tuned for more episodes. In the meantime, please have a look at the Yogascapes in Japan website at yogascapesinjapan.com. Also, if you're feeling generous, please think about making a donation through the GoFundMe account linked to the website. Until next time.